Hey everyone! Welcome back for another chapter of Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria by Dr. Beverly Daniel Tatum. So, we have a lot to discuss today, but first I have a couple announcements. Number one, I apologize for the extreme delay. I know I was recording and posting every Monday, Wednesday, Friday. I did get slightly overwhelmed. For those of you that don't know, I might have mentioned it in my previous videos, I can't remember, but I do have autism and ADHD. The autism is more significant in my opinion, but it does lead to some symptoms that cause me to get extremely overwhelmed with very little responsibility. I am working on another big project, which I will discuss in just a few minutes. Going forward, for the rest of this book, I will be posting on Tuesdays and Thursdays. And so it'll be just 2 times a week instead of 3. And I may or may not start doing 2 chapters at a time and just do quicker summaries with those. Additionally, when I made my last video, I had asked if it was helpful, the notes that I was including in the description with all of my highlights from the book, journal prompts, that kind of thing. I did not receive any responses or comments about that. So for right now, I am not going to be adding all those notes. But if anyone didn't get the chance to respond or miss that opportunity and they were utilizing the description and notes, I'm happy to do it. Just let me know in the comments. You can also reach out to me by message or email. Most of my links to socials are in my bio. And that leads to, I did get a little discouraged. I was really used to posting on TikTok primarily, and doing some of these longer form videos is actually my passion. I love doing it. And so I was really excited to start posting more on YouTube and on my Patreon, but the engagement is different here. And obviously it takes a while to build up. And I know I have a few loyal followers already, and I really, really appreciate y'all. But I was feeling a little discouraged, and I was like, why am I going to continue to do this book review if people aren't watching it or engaging? But then, right when I was about to make an announcement that I was not going to continue to do my recordings about the book, I received a email from somebody that subscribes to me, I think. And it made my entire day and week. And I will be finishing this book regardless of the engagement after getting this, because it meant so much to me. And so that just goes to show that if y'all have creators that you appreciate or you really enjoy their content, even if you're not able to financially support in any way, it's so refreshing to get some of those like thank yous and just, you've helped me. Because a lot of us, I think that's really all we want is to make a difference, even if it's just in one person's life. But their email just said, thank you so much for your very interesting videos on YouTube. I wish more people would be like you. We would definitely go to more peace and love. Thanks a lot for reminding us that deconstructing is a key step on the journey to a more respectful society. And then it said a few more things. I already emailed them back and expressed my gratitude, but I did want to just give a shout out here that really changed the trajectory. And if you have been watching these videos and you've been enjoying them, you can say a silent thank you to this person, because I was about to make an announcement that evening, that I probably wasn't going to continue with the series at this time. But this email just turned all that around. So I'm glad that y'all are enjoying the content, and I will be continuing to post my shorts as well. The last thing that I wanted to talk about is this big project that I'm working on. I will be starting a podcast, and that is something that I've been planning and working really hard on. And I am so excited about this podcast. I think it's going to be really, really, really awesome and have the potential to really improve our society and the way we look at others. I won't go into too many details right now, but if you are able financially, as many of you know, I do not have a job currently. I lost my job in February, and I have been actively applying for part-time jobs, but because of my disabilities, it does make it more difficult for me to just deal with this constant rejection and pressures of corporate America, and also to just be consistently applying for jobs. Transitions are very difficult for me. And obviously, every time you start a new job is a transition. When you lose a job, it's a transition. So lots of transitions. And so if anyone is able to financially assist, the more help I get from my communities, the more that I'm able to work on things like recording and the podcast versus applying for jobs and trying to get at least a part-time job to pay my bills. I don't currently have health insurance. My prescription that I have to take every day is $83. So yeah, times are interesting, but we're getting by, and I'm really grateful to those that are supporting me and helping me, whether that is verbally, in comments, virtually, or financially. All of you are amazing, and I'm very grateful. Okay. I'm really excited about this chapter, so let's jump into it. This starts the new section, which is understanding whiteness in a white context, which we need. So chapter 6 is the development of white identity. And the quote at the beginning of the chapter is, "I'm not ethnic, I'm just normal." And I'm going to read some of the quotes first and then go over my thoughts at the end. So she said that the first question she poses in her workshops is one that most people of color answer without hesitation, which is, what is your class and ethnic background? White participants, however, often pause before responding. On one such occasion, a young white woman quickly described herself as middle class, but seemed stumped as to how to describe herself ethnically. Finally, she said, "I'm just normal." What did she mean? She explained that she did not identify with any particular ethnic heritage and that she was a lot like the other people who lived in her very homogeneous white middle-class community. But her choice of words was telling. If she is just normal, are those who are different from her just abnormal? Like many white people, this young woman had never really considered her own racial and ethnic group membership. For her, whiteness was simply the unexamined norm. Later on, she says there is a lot of silence about race in white communities, and as a consequence, whites tend to think of racial identity as something that other people have, not something that is salient for them. She discusses Debbie Irving and the book Waking Up White and recalls, "The way I understood it, race was for other people, brown and black-skinned people. Don't get me wrong, if you put a census form in my hand, I would know to check white or Caucasian." She goes on to say the messages we receive about assumed superiority or inferiority shape our perceptions of reality and influence our interactions with others. While the task for people of color is to resist negative societal messages and develop an empowered sense of self in the face of a racist society, the task for whites is to develop a positive white identity based in reality, not on assumed superiority. She says many of the white people in my audiences either have not given much thought to the meaning of their racial group membership and so don't feel anything, or they have thought about it and feel uncomfortable. She talks about Paul Kivel, author of Uprooting Racism, How White People Can Work for Racial Justice. And Paul says, whatever our economic status, many white people become paralyzed with some measure of fear, guilt, or defensiveness when racism is addressed. This psychological discomfort is part of the hidden cost of racism for whites. She talks about white privilege, and we talked about in, I believe, chapter 1, that white people have been breathing the smog and internalizing many of the prevailing societal stereotypes of people of color. They typically are unaware of the socialization process. They often perceive themselves as colorblind, completely free of prejudice, unaware of their own assumptions about other racial groups. In addition, they usually think of racism as the prejudiced behaviors of individuals, rather than as an institutionalized system of advantage, benefiting whites in subtle as well as blatant ways. For most whites, the contact frame of mind, as in the model of racial identity development, represents the passive absorption of subtly communicated messages. Robert Carter, another racial identity researcher, said, "There was no one to compare ourselves to. As you would drive through other neighborhoods, I think there was a clear message of difference or even superiority. The neighborhoods were poorer and it was probably subtle. I don't remember my parents being bigoted, although by today's standards they clearly were. I think there was probably a message of superiority. The underlying messages were subtle. No one ever came out and said white people are this and black people are like this. These messages may go unchallenged and unexamined for a long time, perhaps a lifetime." Dr. Tatum says, for white people living in a largely white environments, it is possible to live one's entire life without giving focused attention to what it means to be white. Ethnic identity, being of Irish, Italian, Polish ancestry, for example, may be celebrated as part of a family's cultural traditions, but being white may go unexplored because it just seems normal. Disintegration, which is another phase of racial identity, is marked by a growing awareness of racism and white privilege as a result of personal encounters in which the social significance of race is made visible. I really appreciated this excerpt. She talks about Jill Robbins, a white female blogger, who titled her essay describing her reaction to the online video of the shooting of Philando Castile, "How I Finally Got the Meaning of White Privilege." And this is the excerpt. "If I look into my rearview mirror and see flashing red lights, I'm not afraid. I probably have an oh shit moment, but I have zero fear that I'll be harmed or even harassed by a police officer. I'm a nice white lady in a minivan in suburbia, USA. I might walk away with a ticket or maybe just a warning. No police officer is going to perceive me as a threat or a problem. I don't know what it's like to be hunted or profiled. And that right there is white privilege. It's the knowledge that being a victim of police brutality is probably never going to happen to me. I know that if my white husband had been the one pulled over for a busted taillight, that odds of him getting shot are almost non-existent. A man I don't know who died 2 days before his 33rd birthday has had such a profound impact on me. It means more than something ugly on the news. I don't know if walking away less tunnel-visioned here in my white suburban bubble means anything to anyone else, but it means something to me. She talks about those whose parents were actively anti-racist might have felt less guilt, but often still felt unprepared for addressing racism outside the family, a point highlighted by the comments of this young woman. The excerpt says, talking with other class members, I realized how exceptional my parents were. Not only were they not overtly racist, but they also tried to keep society's subtle racism from reaching me. Basically, I grew up believing that racism was no longer an issue and all people should be treated as equals. Unfortunately, my parents were not being very realistic, as society's racism did begin to reach me. They did not teach me how to support and defend their views once I was interacting in a society without them as a buffer. And this is still in the disintegration frame of racial identity. And she said, white individuals began to see the degree to which their lives and the lives of people of color have been affected by racism in our society. The societal inequities they now notice directly contradict the idea of an American meritocracy, a concept that has typically been an integral part of their belief system. She says responses to this discomfort may include denying the validity of the information that is being presented or psychologically or physically withdrawing from it. The logic is, if I don't read about racism, talk about racism, watch those documentaries or special news programs, or spend time with those people of color, I won't have to feel uncomfortable. If, despite the strong impulse to withdraw, the individual remains engaged, he or she can turn the discomfort into action. Once they have an awareness of the cycle of racism, many people are angered by it and want to interrupt it. Often, action comes in the form of educating others, pointing out the stereotypes as they watch television, interrupting racial jokes, writing letters to the editor, sharing articles with friends and family. Like new converts, people experiencing disintegration can be quite zealous in their efforts. She talks about a student of hers who was a white male student from a very privileged background who stated, I realized that it was possible to simply go through life totally oblivious to the entire situation, or even if one realizes it, one can totally repress it. It is easy to fade into the woodwork, run with the rest of society, and never have to deal with these problems. So many people I know from home are like this. They have simply accepted what society has taught them with little, if any, question. My father is a prime example of this. It has caused much friction in our relationship, and he often tells me, as a father, he has failed in raising me correctly. Most of my high school friends will never deal with these issues and propagate them on to their own children. It's easy to see how the cycle continues. I don't think I could ever justify within myself simply turning my back on the problem. I finally realized that my position in all of these dominant groups gives me power to make change occur. It is an unfortunate result often, though, that I feel alienated from friends and family. It's often played off as a mere stage that I'm going through. I obviously can't tell if it's merely a stage, but I know that they say this to take the attention off the truth of what I'm saying. By belittling me, they take the power out of my argument. It's very depressing that being compassionate and considerate are seen as only phases that people go through. I don't want it to be a phase for me, but as obvious as this may sound, I look at my environment and often wonder how it will not be. Dr. Tatum says the social pressure from friends and acquaintances to collude, to not notice racism can be quite powerful, but it is very difficult to stop noticing something once it has been pointed out. She talks about the relief and how it often comes through the racial identity phase of reintegration. In the reintegration frame of mind, the previous feelings of guilt or denial may be transformed into fear and anger directed toward people of color. The logic is, if there is a problem with racism, then you people of color must have done something to cause it, and if you would just change your behavior, the problem would go away. The elegance of this argument is that it relieves the white person of all responsibility for societal change. Dr. Tatum says that she's sometimes asked if it's absolutely necessary to experience this kind of reintegration thinking. Must one resort to blaming the victim to restore a sense of emotional equilibrium? Although it is not inevitable, most white people who speak up against racism will attest to the temptation they sometimes feel to slip back into collusion and silence. Because the pressure to ignore racism and to accept the socially sanctioned stereotypes is so strong, and the system of advantage so seductive, many white people get stuck in reintegration thinking. Dr. Tatum discusses another source of the discomfort and anger that whites often experience in this phase stems from the frustration of being seen as a group member rather than as an individual. People of color learn early in life that they are seen by others as members of a group. For whites, thinking of oneself only as an individual is a legacy of white privilege. She talks about an author, McIntosh, who writes, "I can swear or dress in secondhand clothes or not answer letters without having people attribute these choices to the bad morals, the poverty, or the illiteracy of my race. I can do well in a challenging situation without being called a credit to my race. I am never asked to speak for all the people of my racial group." In short, she and other whites are perceived as individuals most of the time. Dr. Tatum says in the case of white men, both maleness and whiteness are normative, so acknowledging group status may be particularly difficult. However, understanding one form of oppression does not guarantee recognition of another. She talks about white people who are highly identified with a particular subordinate identity may also struggle with claiming whiteness as a meaningful group category because they feel far from the white male middle class norm. For example, whites who grew up in impoverished circumstances often struggle with the idea that they had anything described as privilege. Jewish people of European ancestry sometimes do not think of themselves as white because for them the term means white Christian. Similarly, white people whose central group identification is with the LGBTQ community sometimes find it hard to claim privilege status as whites when they are so targeted by homophobia and heterosexism, often at the hands of other whites. She talks about Heather Hackman, a social justice educator who identifies as a lesbian, that described her own journey as a college student, initially resisting any new understanding of race. Heather said, "I just wanted people to stop calling me a racist. I took in just enough information to make it seem like I was on board with racial issues. But if one were to scratch beneath the surface, one would see that I had no real knowledge of racial issues, and worse, I had no real desire to know. I could not see why I should care about it because I could not see myself in this country's story of race. But something was percolating in me that made this ignorance untenable. My identity as a feminist, coming out as a lesbian, and learning how the systems of oppression associated with those identities worked were beginning to make it impossible for me to persist in my racial delusions. My last 2 years of college were filled with moment after moment, lesson after lesson, and conversation after conversation that helped me to see that learning about racial issues in earnest and then speaking out about racial oppression was deeply connected to my speaking out about gender and queer oppression, and that I could not advocate for the latter without addressing the former." Even when white men and women don't see or think of themselves as white, other people still do. She then talks about Lois Stalvey, who was an author that wrote a classic memoir, The Education of a Wasp, in which she describes her own responses to the ways Black people tested her trustworthiness. She wrote, "I could never resent the tests as some white people have told me they do. But to me, the longest tests have always indicated the deepest hurts. We whites would have to be naive to expect that hundreds of years of humiliation can be forgotten the moment we wish it to be. At times, the most poignant part of the test is that Black people have enough trust left to give it. Testing implies we might pass this test. It is safer and easier for a Black person to turn his back on us. If he does not gamble on our sincerity, he cannot be hurt if we prove false." Dr. Tatum talks about effective consciousness raising about racism must also point the way toward constructive action. When people don't have the tools for moving forward, they tend to return to what is familiar, often becoming more vigorous in their defense of the racial status quo than they were initially. As we have seen, many white people experience themselves as powerless even in the face of privilege, but the fact is that we all have a sphere of influence, some domain in which we exercise some level of power and control. The task for each of us, white and of color, is to identify what our own sphere of influence is, however large or small, and to consider how it might be used to interrupt the cycle of racism. She talks about how, as a white person's understanding of the complexity of institutional racism in our society deepens, resorting to explanations that blame the victim become less likely. Instead, deepening awareness usually leads to a commitment to unlearn one's racism and marks the emergence of the pseudo-independent status. Sometimes epitomized by the guilty white liberal persona, the individual whose thinking is dominated by a pseudo-independent mindset has achieved an intellectual understanding of racism as a system of advantage, but doesn't quite know what to do about it. Self-conscious and feeling guilty about one's own whiteness, the individual often desires to escape it by associating with people of color. She talks about Ruth Frankenberg, author of White Women, Race Matters, The Social Construction of Whiteness, who describes the confusing emotions of this process in an autobiographical essay. Quote, "I viewed my racial privilege as total. I remember months when I was terrified to speak in gatherings that were primarily of color, since I feared that anything I did say would be marked by my whiteness, my racial privilege, which in my mind meant the same. When her friends of color were making casual conversation, chatting about their mothers, for example, she would worry that anything she might say about her own mother would somehow reveal her race privilege. And by the time she had sorted it out mentally, the topic of conversation would have changed. She writes, in that silence, I tried to pass. As what? As racially unmarked, as exceptional, as the one white girl who could, quote, hang, end quote. What Dr. Tatum talked about a student of hers who wrote, one of the major and probably most difficult steps in identity development is obtaining or finding the consciousness of what it means to be white. I definitely remember many a time that I wished I was not white, ashamed of what I and others have done to the other racial groups in the world. I wanted to pretend I was black, live with them, celebrate their culture, and deny my whiteness completely. Basically, I wanted to escape the responsibility that came with identifying myself as white. Dr. Tatum says, for many white people who have come to understand the everyday reality of racism, whiteness is still experienced as a source of shame rather than a source of pride. And she says once we get to this stage, the resource that we need the most are not people of color, but other whites who are further along in the process and can help show them the way. The next section is the search for white allies and the restoration of hope. She mentions there is a history of white protest against racism, a history of whites who have resisted the role of oppressor and who have been allies to people of color. Unfortunately, these whites are often invisible to us. While the names of active racists are easily recalled, past and present Klan leaders and Southern segregationists, for example, the names of white allies are often unknown. She talks about how it can be very helpful to read books about the deconstruction journey and anti-racism that have been written by white people when you're in this phase at first, and how the narratives can provide an antidote to the feelings of isolation and loneliness that white people often feel at this point. There is comfort in knowing that others have traveled this terrain. One of the consequences of racism in our society is that those who oppose racism are often marginalized, and as a result, their stories are not widely known. White people who are doing this work need to continue to make their stories known to serve as guides for others. So Dr. Tatum talks about how she had a white ally come to talk to some of her students, and how her white students often found the topic of racism depressing, especially as they deepen their understanding of how deeply ingrained it is in the structures of our society. Yet they found the opportunity to talk with this ally gave them renewed hope. Through her example, they could see that the role of the ally is not to help those targeted by racism, but to stand in solidarity with them, speaking up against systems of oppression and to challenge other whites to do the same. She talks about how participation in white consciousness-raising groups organized specifically for the purpose of examining one's own racism is a powerful way to keep moving forward. While people of color bear the brunt of racism, large numbers of white people have also been failed by the system, facing job loss, inadequate housing, and cutbacks in core services. Instead of addressing real fears and insecurity, racist elites actively target working-class white people into blaming people of color for the problems their families and vulnerable communities face. She says, I am sometimes asked why such groups need to be made up of whites only. To many whites, it seems inconceivable that there would be any value in participating in all-white discussions of racism. Well, of course, there is value in cross-racial dialogue. All-white support groups serve a unique function. Particularly when whites are trying to work through their feelings of guilt and shame, separate groups give white people the space to speak with honesty and candor, rarely possible in racially mixed groups. Even when whites feel comfortable sharing these feelings with people of color, frankly, people of color don't necessarily want to hear about it. The following comment, written by a Black woman in Dr. Tatum's class, stated, many times in class I feel uncomfortable when white students use the term Black, because even if they aren't aware of it, they say it with all or at least a lot of the negative connotations they've been taught goes along with Black. Sometimes it just causes a stinging feeling inside of me. Sometimes I get real tired of hearing white people talk about the conditions of Black people. I think it's an important thing for them to talk about, but still I don't always like being around when they do it. I also get tired of hearing them talk about how hard it is for them, though I understand it. And most times I'm very willing to listen and be open, but sometimes I can't. Right now I can't. Dr. Tatum goes on to talk about the fourth step, which is immersion in racial identity development. Though a white person may need to describe the racist things a parent or spouse has said or done to tell the story to a person of color may reopen that person's wounds. Listening to those stories and problem solving about them is a job that white people can do for each other. It is at this stage of redefining whiteness, immersion, that the feelings of guilt and shame start to fade. Reflecting on her own white identity development, sociologist Becky Thompson chronicles this process. Quote, I understood that I didn't have to recreate the wheel in my own life. I began to actively seek writing by white women who have historically stood up against racism. She also realized that she needed anti-racist white people in her daily life with whom she could share stories and whom she could trust to give her honest feedback. Her experience in a white anti-racism group helped her to stop feeling bad because she was white. She writes, quote, I started seeing ways to channel my energies without trying to leave a piece of my identity behind. The last status, autonomy, which is the fifth and final in racial identity development, represents the most developed of the racial identity frames. With this mindset, a person has incorporated the newly defined view of whiteness as part of a personal identity. The positive feelings associated with this redefinition energize the person's efforts to confront racism and oppression in daily life. Clayton Alderfer, a white man with many years of personal and professional experience as an organizational psychologist, described the thinking that characterizes this stage. Quote, we have a more complete awareness of ourselves and of others to the degree that we neither negate the uniqueness of each person, regardless of that person's group membership, nor deny the ever-present effects of group memberships for each individual. While autonomy might be described as racial self-actualization, racial identity development never really ends. The person who has experienced the deeper understanding of autonomy is characteristically open to new information and new ways of thinking about racial and cultural variables. Dr. Tatum writes, even when active anti-racist thinking predominates, there may still be particular situations that trigger old modes of responding. It is in those moments that being part of a white support group can be especially helpful. In her book, Witnessing Whiteness, Shelley Toshlook adds to the thinking about this autonomy phase by proposing that rather than striving to, quote, become an ally, end quote, which suggests a completed process, it might be better to speak of doing effective ally work, which implies a continuing process of growth and learning. Within this approach, our anti-racism efforts are not in service of people of color. They are part of our own effort to shed the socialization that has led to us behaving in ways that support and maintain the oppression of others. In this way, our sense of ourselves as being fully human is realized when we work toward educational, economic, social, and environmental justice. Within this community are people who can help me see privilege and racism more clearly, motivate me to continue constructing a healthy and effective anti-racism practice, and support me to keeping moving forward in times when I fail. Though the process of examining their racial identity can be uncomfortable and even frightening for whites, those who persist in the struggle are rewarded with an increasingly multiracial and multicultural existence. She talks about Becky Thompson, who is white and has experienced it. She writes, we need to talk about what living in this borderland feels like, how we get there, what sustains us, and how we benefit from it. For me, this place of existence is tremendously exciting, invigorating, and life-affirming. Though it can also be complicated and lonely, it is also liberating, opening doors to new communities, creating possibilities for more authentic connections with people of color, and in the process, strengthening the coalitions necessary for genuine social change. So I mentioned before that this chapter was long, and it is a lot, but so powerful and so good. Like when I was done reading it, I felt seen and I was in a good mood because I remembered the journey. There's just so much that's covered in here. One of the parts that was so powerful to me was talking about the test and how Black people, when they don't want to put their trust in white people, that is safer because if they don't gamble on our sincerity, they can't be hurt if we prove false. And all of us that are on social media or around other white people regularly know that we frequently do. We frequently prove false to what we have claimed to be. We see it all the time. So when she talks about the white identity and having like the guilty white liberal persona, and that's when you're in the pseudo-independent mindset phase, and so we're just guilty and ashamed of being white, that's important. And so many white people, including me, have had that experience and have been like, I'm scared to say anything at all. I'm scared that I will say the wrong thing. And that's because you're in that pseudo-independent. Like you've learned some, but you don't know what to do about it. So you're just chilling, literally not knowing what to do next. And so you're scared of doing anything at all. So we are drawn to people of color at that phase, right? But what we need are more white people, and especially white people that are further along on the journey than we are. I do think having people that are at a similar place in the journey is also helpful, at least for me. But they need to be at a similar place enough that they're, like she talks about, able to hold me accountable and help guide me. And I do have a white community that can do that, and that helps me do that. A couple, actually. I do have a Discord, and it is an intersectional space, but we do have a white channel, and there is a private one as well for some private things. And we meet on the second Sunday of every month, and more often if people want to. But that's just the one that I'm committed to leading, where we talk about things. If somebody has an issue that they want to discuss, or they're struggling with something, like where are you at in your deconstruction journey, that kind of thing. I'm also in an Antiracism Book Club. So all things where you can build community. And if anyone is interested, please let me know, and I'd be happy to share those resources with you. And she talks about how one of the consequences of racism in our society is that those who oppose racism are often marginalized, and as a result, their stories aren't widely known, and how that can be really lonely as well when we start confronting racism. And that is so true. So you might realize that you've come to a level on your growth journey that you don't have as much in common with your family or friends. Like, they think you're going through a weird phase. Maybe they think you're, quote, woke, end quote. And our feelings are not for us to share with people of color. We have piled on to them enough. They are for us to share with each other and help each other through. And that's something that we tend to not be very good at. Like, we've heard before that white people are not the best at building community. But I think part of that comes with trusting other white people. So if somebody is on the anti-racism journey, being okay to talk to them, hold them accountable. And then I like how she talks about, even in the autonomy phase, there may still be certain situations that trigger the old mode of thinking or old responses. So like, I still will start typing a comment sometimes and then erase it and not comment it because I'm like, that's so centering. Or like, and so that's one of the beautiful things, is that it's a continual learning. You know, my older brother is very religious, and he told me once, that's why they call it practicing religion, is because you're never going to be perfect at it. Nobody's going to be perfect at it. We just practice to the best of our ability and try to improve every day. And I think anti-racism work is very similar to that. It's a practice. So we're not going to reach an end point. There's not going to come a time where we're like, I've arrived. I am complete in my anti-racism journey. Instead, it's like the continual learning. That's what's important. When she talks about how we're not in service of people of color, I think that that's one of the biggest misconceptions about anti-racism work. A lot of people that are trolling me in my comments or whatever will throw out the phrase, like, you're a white savior. And I used to not understand what that meant or how I could avoid being a white savior. And it just makes so much sense the further you go along, because the difference is when we are not, exactly as she says, we're not in service to people of color. They do not need our help. In fact, they would be better off if we did not exist, right? Because we have historically and systemically continued to cause harm and still continue to do that today. So they truly do not need us. They don't need our help. But what we can do is focus on our own healing, our own efforts to change our behaviors and cause less harm. And that's why we don't need to talk to them about the feelings and emotions and hardness of deconstructing, because that's for us. And I really liked how she said that those who persist in the struggle are rewarded with an increasingly multiracial and multicultural existence, and how that's tremendously exciting, invigorating, and life-affirming. So about 4-5 years ago, I had no Black friends, 0, before COVID. Today, I am so grateful and blessed to have multiple friends that are Black and of the global majority. And that would not be possible without the Black women that I learned from on TikTok and then Patreon that I subscribe to now. Links to their pages are in my bio. So if you want to follow too or subscribe, highly recommend. And I've often said that although personal fulfillment isn't the goal, I feel so much more whole since I've been deconstructing. So much more whole. And especially if I keep with it and don't try to shove it down. Like if we can make it past that point of the shame, being ashamed of our whiteness, it's just a place of increased awareness. It really is. And it's awesome. And you have much more authentic connections with people, both white and Black. Like, my connections with white people are better because I'm more self-aware. Like, we have to start with our own internal healing, our own actions, and our own ingrained white supremacy. It's so important. And no matter how far along we think we are, remember that we can always move back into those modes where we are acting on the same thing. So I think if I was going to give one tip from my perspective that has been the biggest struggle, but also probably one of the biggest things I've learned and that I'm still working on, don't get me wrong, I'm never going to be perfect at anything, but that is to go into every conversation and to take every amount of constructive feedback from a place of questioning. So if someone, even if I think they're a troll or a bot in my comments, says, okay, you're being a white savior, instead of automatically being like, I'm not being a white savior, I would be inclined to potentially ask them, what parts of my actions or words made you perceive that I'm a white savior? But I think it's so important for us to go into our interactions with that questioning mindset at all times, because we really struggle with that. The perfectionism tenet of white supremacy, we just want to be perfect at everything. And if we are not, we get so defensive and we want to be comforted. And we want to comfort others. If I see a white person mess up, still to this very day, I'm inclined to be like, oh, it's okay. You didn't mean to do that. I still do that. I try to make them comfy. We all have work to do. But in our communities of white people, we can get there. We are getting there, some of us. And we can pass those things on to our white comrades. So for me, I don't push anyone in my life. I might send them articles or mention things because anti-racism work is a huge part of my life. And I want to share parts that I love and that make me feel fulfilled with my family and friends. But I don't push anyone into this work that is not ready. Instead, I try to lead by example. I try to ask questions, try to see where they're coming from. And that's largely what my podcast is going to be based on, which is where I got the idea. So I'm going to tell you all this, one of my taglines for my podcast, because it applies here. And I think it'll help everybody to go into the coming days and weeks with this mindset. Say less, ask more. If you're tempted to talk, correct someone, instead ponder, like Rebecca, White One Whisperer says, why am I even talking? But then say like, am I assuming something? Or should I be asking a question instead? Say less. Ask more. Y'all are awesome. So the next one that we are going to be doing, which I may try to release this weekend because I'm trying to get through this book in a good amount of time, is Chapter 7, White Identity, Affirmative Action, and Colorblind Racial Ideology. Sounds very intriguing. And I'll probably do like a more quick summary and do the 2 chapters, like just kind of a quick summary and then just talk about it a bit. But if you watch this whole thing, let me know what you think, what you would like to see, what is helpful. Or if you do not watch all these videos, tell me to stop doing them because they are time consuming. And I want to do them if they're helpful, but I don't want to do things that aren't helpful because I already read the book, you know? Well, I'm still working my way through it, but I've already read the chapters when I yap on here to y'all about it. All right. Y'all are amazing. Have a good weekend. Make good choices. Ask more questions. Bye.